I think despite all these changes, it's fair to say that, you know, you can talk about a good 4 decades of sort of efforts to sort of change the banks and change their function. And the banking sector still remains in poor condition. Essentially what has happened is that much of the cost of modernizing China and the changes that have taken place have essentially been borne by the banking system. Okay? So although banks have had a commercial mandate, they're ultimately controlled by the state, and they have been the ones, in the absence of foreign capital, that have been financing China's modernization, China's economic modernization. So while the industrial sector has been able to privatize a lot more of these benefits, the banking sector has had to essentially bear the cost of this on its balance sheet. Alongside this, the sort of change to a commercial banking system has meant that a lot of the problems that have arisen under the Anglo-Saxon system, such as concentration of banks' activities, the closure of branches, this has happened in China, but without a sort of modern banking system being established. So the banks themselves, by listing and privatizing, have had a much greater incentive to close branches in rural areas, to close branches that are not profitable, essentially leaving large parts of rural China unbanked. Again, in the absence of a lot of these controls, corruption and malpractice has been a big problem in the banking sector, far worse than in the industrial sector. So the levels of corruption and the levels of sort of asset stripping in the banking sector have been far worse than in any other sector. And ultimately, loans are still not allocated according to commercial criteria. And again, if you want an example of that, you can look at the recent fiscal stimulus, where essentially banks were told to implement the stimulus via the banking system. They lent to local governments. A lot of these loans were made not based on commercial criteria, and China's National Audit Office has published some very interesting surveys of these loans since, which show that a lot of the loans made to local governments under this fiscal stimulus, a lot of the projects that were invested in deliver almost no return, and certainly not enough to cover the interest rates being charged by the state banks. So the suspicion is that the non-performing loan problem that banks suffered in the 1990s could re-emerge if China's local governments are not able to pay back a lot of this capital that they were given during the fiscal stimulus. So I think, you know, in exploring why this is the case and why banks still have these problems, it's probably worth starting with this sort of triangular system and asking the question, well, has anything really changed? So I've given you a quote from a state-owned enterprise manager, and this was reported as part of his trial in Xinhua. And basically he said, well, I will use this is quite recent, and he said, well, I will use state funds to set up more companies. If the businesses are good, the profits are mine. If the businesses are bad, the state covers my losses. So many other state-owned enterprises bosses have done that. So essentially saying that this whole thing of using state capital and using capital from the banking system unproductively in the state sector is still right. And state enterprises bosses simply view the loans that they give, that they're given by state banks, as essentially free capital. If they can make money out of them, they get the rewards. If not, the banks will bear the cost. And this is really the fundamental sort of principle or characteristic of the triangular loan system, that essentially state enterprises know that the loans banks give them, state banks give them, do not have to be repaid, and the banks themselves know that, well, actually this doesn't really matter, because if the loans go bad, the government will bail us out. So this is the sort of triangular system made up of sort of three state-owned institutions: the fiscal system, the state banks, and the state enterprises. So what are the features of a triangular loan system? Well, essentially, the first one is that there are no outside checks and balances to monitor lending decisions. So there's no outside body. All the institutions involved are state-owned. So there's nothing outside to monitor whether lending decisions are made, are good or bad. Related to this point is that, well, what happens if things go wrong? You know, what is the signal to say that something goes wrong? Well, the answer is there's actually no obvious signal to say that there's a problem. Okay? If banks are able to just roll over the bad loans, and every so often they're recapitalized by the state, you don't actually know that something is going wrong until banks are in an awful lot of trouble. Okay? Because these bad loans take quite a while to feed through onto the balance sheet, and it requires either the state enterprise to go bust or the fiscal system to go bust before you actually realize you have a big problem. The third problem is that it becomes very difficult under this scenario for the state to shut down failing banks, essentially because it cannot really determine whether the bank is failing because of bad decisions made by the bank itself, or simply because the bank was just implementing the policy decisions of the Chinese government. So was the decision to lend to a state enterprise, was it a policy decision, in which case the government can't say, well, you made a bad decision, because the bank will just say, well, we're only doing what we were told in the state plan. And it becomes quite difficult then to say, well, was it a policy loan, or was it actually a bad decision by the bank? So it becomes very difficult for the state to discipline or find out what was going wrong with the banks. I think the interesting thing about the bad loan problem in China is that because bad loans became so big and such a large problem, particularly in the 1990s, it's difficult to say that all of these decisions were simply policy lending. Because if they were all policy lending, well then, how did the economy grow so much? The Chinese economy was growing by about 10% a year during this period. So if it's policy lending, you shouldn't get these levels of growth, you shouldn't get these levels of investment. So the suspicion is that probably a lot of these NPLs were made on a corrupt basis or on a basis of very poor lending decisions. Again, the fact that there's nobody outside to monitor it means that you have this lack of information and oversight, which means that essentially, number one, banks can't perform the function of screening loan applications, and number two, the state enterprises themselves receive these loans at a very low cost. And as a result, they have a very, very small incentive to ensure that they're used in a productive way. So if a firm has a lot of capital and it's very cheaply provided, in fact it's subsidized, it has very little incentive to ensure that this capital is productively employed. So again, if we go back to last week's lecture, or 2 weeks ago actually at this stage, if we go back to our lecture 2 weeks ago and we say, well, looking at the problems that firms were facing in the oil sector, where you had a lot of refineries that were below capacity and not run according to commercial criteria, or not run according to international capacity standards, and you sort of say, well, if these enterprises were also getting very cheap capital, well, there's very little incentive for them to reform. And then you say, take that forward a step, and what these enterprises are being asked to do now. Well, they're asked to become more efficient, implement, develop greener infrastructure, reduce the emissions in fuel, all of this. which actually does require quite a lot of capital and a lot of capital investment, suddenly the banks again are saying, well, are we the ones who are going to have to lend the state enterprises all this money again to implement this agenda when we've already been giving them a lot of cheap capital? So there's a lot of related issues between the state banks and the state enterprises, and the sort of targets that the Chinese government has set these enterprises going forward. The final feature of this is what we call the giant state-owned enterprise syndrome. And this is essentially where enterprises themselves become so big that it becomes very difficult for the state to allow them to fail. Okay? And that applies to both the banking system and the industrial sector. So in the banking system, allowing one of the state banks to fail or go bust would be catastrophic. Okay? You would have an awful lot of depositors affected, you would never get a lot of the loans back. Similarly, telling the state banks to stop lending to some of the very large state-owned enterprises would also put them in a lot of jeopardy. So in a sense, you get this joint state-owned enterprise syndrome that is very difficult to pull back from. I've just given you sort of a diagram which shows you the sort of relationship in this triangular loan system. So on one side you have the state banks, who in a sense make policy and political loans when they need recapitalization. So they're asked by the fiscal system to make these loans. When they look to be recapitalized, they ask the fiscal system to be recapitalized. You have state-owned enterprises here who they benefit from soft policy or political lending, but they use this to finance social burdens. So they might like to keep their employment levels high. They might like to keep the services they offer workers high. So these are a lot of the inherited burdens that they inherited from the pre-reform system. They have non-performing debts with state banks. State banks can recapitalize that from the fiscal system. The state-owned enterprises themselves are also connected to the fiscal system. If we remember, they're the main source of traditionally the main source of earnings for the fiscal system. So if they're doing badly, they give decreasing revenue to the fiscal system, and that increases their fiscal burden on this fiscal system. So in a sense, it's this continuous circle that goes round and round, and it's very difficult to actually get out of it. And I suppose if you look at the current reforms, what China is really trying to do is, in a sense, where state banks are now, is to try and bring in more private capital to sort of add an additional layer of governance between the fiscal system and the state-owned enterprises, so that the relationship is no longer so straightforward between the two. Okay? So in a sense, increase the revenue ability of the state sector and decrease its burden on the fiscal system. Okay? So in a sense, breaking up the triangular system involves, in a sense, putting institutions in between these three institutions. So if we look at the consequences of this system, the first one has been, so in a sense we're talking about a system that has been partially reformed. So you still have the triangular system, but at the margins you have some level of privatization, you have some level of shareholder involvement. So what's happened is that banks under this system have become increasingly, they've decided, well, just like the other enterprises, we need to maximize profits because that's what the state is telling us. So on the one hand, you've had the type of concentration and rationalization of branches or bank branches that you've had under the Anglo-Saxon system, but you've also had corruption and malpractice that the sort of Anglo-Saxon system is designed to eliminate. So you've almost like the worst of both worlds. So two examples of this, and to understand how these happen, well, the first very big scandal that emerged in the 2000s was a land scandal in Shanghai, where essentially a property developer who was trying to sort of push urban residents was trying to get the land that people had houses on for redevelopment, and he was doing this through all sorts of illegal means, so he was pushing them out. The residents weren't very happy, so they petitioned to the government, and the government looked into it, and it was essentially found that this guy was using shares that he had in a company on the Shanghai Stock Exchange to finance loans with the Bank of China, and essentially, although using shares as collateral for loans is not necessarily illegal, it's a very dodgy practice because the value of shares can go up and down, particularly in Shanghai. So he was using this as collateral to acquire this land and redevelop this land, whereas the banks had said that we will no longer do things like this. We will no longer give cozy deals. We will insist on proper collateral as part of the reform process. And in a sense, this scandal exposed a lot of the ways that land was being acquired for development. It was being financed through the use of unorthodox collateral that wouldn't be accepted by banks under the Anglo-Saxon system. And it was also being used to appropriate land. So in a sense, there was a lot of illegal issues going on, and banks were playing their role in financing this. Again, in 2006, there was another big pension scandal in Shanghai where it turned out that funds that were supposed to be used to finance the pensions of municipal workers in Shanghai were actually being siphoned off through the financial system and used illegally for illegal investments and for personal benefit of government officials. So, in a sense, there was no checks in the banking system. People could almost, acquire loans with very dodgy collateral, and they could appropriate money from the fiscal system quite easily, including pension funds, without any major consequences. The third consequence, and it's quite a recent one, is that banks themselves have realized that actually this triangular loan system doesn't deliver you a lot of returns. So actually there's a more profitable way of making money, and that's through off-balance sheet lending. So in a sense, state-owned enterprises have a lot of capital that they got quite cheaply, and they've got nothing to do with it. So what we'll do is we'll guarantee this capital of state enterprises if they want to lend it onto the private sector. So we'll, in a sense, act as an intermediary for these loans. We'll charge quite a high fee, so some of the fees reported for these loans were 20–25%. So private enterprises will be charged interest rates of 20–25%, whereas state enterprises were getting the money at about 3 or 4%. And state banks were guaranteeing these loans off balance sheet. Essentially, by guaranteeing them, they were saying that if the loans turn bad, we'll pay up. So a lot of the risk that had previously been on balance sheet and that was visible in things like non-performing loans ratios actually started to be transferred off balance sheet. And in effect, this reflected the sort of change in risk culture at the state banks. So state banks were no longer driven by a sort of Maoist ideology or this sort of very conservative Maoist ethic that they had been before 1978. They had now become, their culture had changed so much that not only were they willing to do risky lending on balance sheet, but they were also willing to do it off balance sheet. And it was estimated in 2010 that this had grown so much that about 25% of all loans created in China in 2010 were actually off balance sheet. The thing about off-balance sheet lending is that, in theory it's not such a problem. You could say, well, it's just state banks recognizing that there's more efficient business to be had elsewhere, so they lend the cap, they guarantee it. State-owned enterprises have too much capital, so why not lend it on to private enterprises? Well, the risk to the banking sector, and particularly the People's Bank of China, is that this type of activity is very difficult to monitor. Okay? Because banks have it off balance sheet, it's very difficult to know the quality of these loans. It's very difficult to know, whether or not it would be repaid. It's very difficult to know, how quickly the system would unravel if all of these, if say for a large proportion of these loans became due or these obligations became due at once. So it creates a lot of risk. Even more so when we think that most of this risk is probably underwrote by the state anyway, because of the triangular system. So in a sense, you end up with the problem of concealed non-performing loans. And as we said, this was particularly problematic in the recent fiscal stimulus, when essentially the Chinese state said to its banks, you need to implement this fiscal stimulus through your balance sheet, and the banks themselves had no power to object. But on balance, managers probably thought, well, it doesn't matter, because if local governments can't pay back, if state enterprises can't pay back, it doesn't really matter, because based on past experience, in the 1990s we were bailed out, so we'll be bailed out again. The implication of this is that really, although China has a very different banking system to in the West, this issue of moral hazard, or not really having to worry about the consequences of your actions, appears to be just as pervasive under this banking system as any other banking system. So in a sense, if we look at the banking system, we can say, well, there are still a lot of missing pieces or a lot of missing institutions that need to be created before the state banking sector is fully reformed. So you've got legal and institutional deficits. In a sense, banks can't bankrupt the state enterprise until there's a bankruptcy or a fully functioning bankruptcy law in place. They can't demand collateral for loan repayment until property rights are fully reformed. So until people can realistically lay claim to a specific asset. And that's particularly important in the rural sector, where a lot of rural enterprises and a lot of farmers in particular do not have full claim to the land. So the government still nominally owns the land that they farm on. So how do they use this as collateral to get finance? Well, it's very difficult. So these are essentially institutional deficits and legal deficits that are still there, that sort of prevent banks from essentially forcing the people who owe them money to repay. At the governance level, banks lack the flexibility and independence to appoint independent directors. So in a sense, bringing outsiders in is very difficult. And if you look at the board of directors of Chinese banks, up to the mid-2000s, there was very few outsiders. Most of the sort of senior people at chief executive level, at board of director level, were people who had worked their way up through the party system or worked their way up through the banks themselves. So in a sense, despite the reforms that had taken place in the state sector generally during the 1990s, this sort of core principle of CCCP, or Chinese Communist Party appointment of financial executives, was preserved in the financial sector. So in a sense, the Communist Party maintained and continued to maintain a very tight grip over the appointment of senior officials. The problem with this, in a sense, is there's two problems. The first is that in order to do a lot of what China wants to do, in terms of currency internationalization, in terms of creating a more diverse set of financial institutions like pension funds, like equity funds, to create all this, you need a lot of different type of personnel, and you need people who have experience of these type of markets abroad. If you're going to maintain control, very tight control, over the appointment of senior officials in these sectors, it becomes very difficult to bring back people from abroad, like they've done in a lot of other sectors. So, for example, in science and technology, China has been quite successful in bringing back talented Chinese who have become heads of research labs and in the UK and the United States. In the financial sector, it's been very difficult to do that because it's very difficult to trust these people to know whether they will run the banks the way China wants them to. So in order to do this, this principle of keeping a tight control over executive appointments has to be reformed. But it's very difficult to reform. The second problem with it is that previously, when China was making these appointments, when the Communist Party appointed officials to run banks and to senior levels in the financial sector, they could assume that these people would be very loyal. So if you look at the appointments of pre-1978, if you look at the type of people that China appointed to run its banks abroad, so in Hong Kong there was a branch of the Bank of China, and it was run by someone who was best friends with Zhou Enlai, and had very strong, who went to the sort of party congress in Beijing every year, and so on. So they appointed people who they knew and could be trusted as being loyal. Nowadays, this loyalty is much harder to assume. And there's a very interesting case of a banker called Wang Jubing, and he was essentially a protege of Zhu Rongji, and he was appointed to head up China Construction Bank in the late 1990s. He was educated in the UK in the 1970s. He attended London School of Economics. So he was one of a new breed of Chinese bankers that had emerged after the ending of the Cultural Revolution. And he was appointed to head up China Construction Bank. He was appointed to head up the New York office of the Bank of China. So he was given some very senior positions, but he was corrupt. He was extremely corrupt. And in 2001, I think, or 2002, just before the Bank of China was listed on the Hong Kong stock market, he was arrested for corruption, and he was thrown in jail, and I think he was given quite a significant jail sentence. But it showed that within the Chinese Communist Party, the previous sort of assumption that all senior officials would be loyal to the communist ethic and the communist ideology, this no longer applied. So in a sense, the traditional party mechanism, or traditional party mechanism for disciplining cadres, this could no longer be used to discipline bankers. And the final one, is that alongside the idea that it could no longer be assumed that officials would be loyal, it could also no longer be assumed that officials would follow the rules. Okay? And again, a very interesting example of this was in 2008-2009, during the fiscal stimulus, where you had officials from the NBRC, the sort of planning body, advocating banks to essentially lend directly to local governments, even though it was illegal. So banks were not legally allowed to lend directly to local governments. They could lend indirectly, but there were actually officials who were advocating that banks cast aside the rules in the name of the fiscal stimulus. So in a sense, you have a lot of rule breaking, even though these rules are there and sort of nominally on the books of the banking regulator. The incentives for a lot of officials, both at national and local level, is actually to break these rules in the name of economic growth and keeping economic growth. Because obviously at the local level, the incentives for political promotion are far stronger than the sort of national level, sort of agenda of enforcing rules. So you've often this difference between national and local levels, which means that local level officials have a very strong incentive to break rules. So we can see sort of there that you have a lot of issues and you have a lot of policies that sort of, in a sense, the reform of the banking sector has been quite piecemeal. So you've got a lot of bits that have been reformed, but you've got a lot of other bits that are missing. So what can we say about this, and how has China, in a sense, responded from a policy perspective to these challenges? Well, you can say that the first point maybe to